Welcome to Double Trouble, Macdonald-Laurier Institute's new podcast series, where we explore the implications of the emerging axis of authoritarianism between Russia and China for Canada, for our allies, our friends, and the world. Double Trouble is generously supported by Konrad-Adenauer Foundation's Canada office. I'm Dr. Balkan Devlen, Director of the Transatlantic Program at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and I am joined here today with my friend and colleague, Jonathan Berkshire Miller, who is the Director of Foreign Affairs, National Security, and National Defense. In this first episode, what we would like to do is to give you an overview of what this new series is all about, what we are planning to do for the rest of this year, and how we see the implications and the importance of this rising axis between Russia and China, and why we need to, and our allies need to think very carefully and prepare to deal with this dual challenge, what we call the double trouble. Jonathan, welcome.
Thanks so much, Balkan. Thanks for setting this up. And, as Balkan noted, we're delighted to kick off this podcast, eminently grateful to the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation for helping us out with this. And I think a little bit of the thought process behind this is that as Canada has been a little bit too slow for our liking at articulating its foreign policy interests and the challenges that our allies and partners are facing overseas, the Institute has been spending a decent amount of our time and a large focal point in our foreign policy work at looking at the challenge that China poses, of course, and we're seeing this play out very clearly with the threats to our democracy, our resilience, and also our allies in the Indo-Pacific. And then, of course, with Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine in 2022, following up from their initial invasion in 2014. But I think the interesting framework that we're looking at the Institute, and I think that this podcast hopes to delve into more, is the interconnection between those challenges. We see increasingly, while it is not a formal alliance, there's definitely a convergence of strategic interests in many spheres, in many geographies. This is not just limited to the war in Ukraine. We're seeing this happen in the Indo-Pacific. We're seeing this happen in the Arctic. And increasingly, we're seeing this happen more broadly in the global South, in the Americas, and also in sub-Saharan Africa. So we're looking forward to this podcast, delving in with a number of different authors, of course, friends from Germany and Europe, but also those further afield as well to tease out some of these topics.
I couldn't agree anymore, Jonathan. One of the key issues that we would like to explore in this podcast series is delve into the specific challenges that these regimes, Russia and China, poses to our interests and values across the world, but also how working together they amplify their policies and their assault to our institutions, our interests, our values, and our friends across the board. I think it is crucial at this stage, especially in the past 2 to 3 years, to recognize that there is an alignment between Russia and China, that while pursuing their individual interests in their respective regions and for China globally, they aligned with the purposes of undermining the existing international order. And in order to do that, they are not only targeting the rules of the game, that liberal democracy, freedom of navigation, territorial integrity, the very basics of international order, as both Russia and China are doing, but also reach into our own societies and subvert and weaken our institutions, and our democracy and our society in order to paralyze the reactions that the West and its allies can engage in response to this assault. So this series will explore ranging anywhere from the geopolitics in the Arctic to how to think more thoroughly about the security in the Indo-Pacific beyond China, to the implications of private military companies in Africa and in the Middle East, to how to think about the security of the Baltic region, etc. So this interconnectedness of this challenge, and how Canada's allies and friends need to also coordinate and work together to push back for this emerging alliance, emerging axis between Russia and China, is going to be the center of this podcast series. So, Jonathan, let's maybe very briefly delve into some of the specific challenges, in a very broad sense, these regimes pose to Canadian interests and values, and to the security and prosperity of our friends and allies in the world. When you look at China, for example, what are the primary challenges that we face? And then we can talk about a little bit on Russia, and we can talk about how allies in Europe need to think about China, and how, for example, Canada, US, and our Indo-Pacific allies need to think about the challenge that Russia poses.
Well, I think China poses challenges across the board. So I think the important framework at the onset, and why should Canadians care, is number one, of course, we talked a little at the onset about foreign interference challenges, the foreign influence challenges, challenges with the theft of intellectual property, forced technology transfers, economic coercion, arbitrary detention, of course, of our citizens, the so-called two Michaels who were detained for over 3 years. So Canadians know the brunt of the personal bilateral damage in this relationship. Soybean farmers know this. Pork farmers suffered from economic coercion as well. But the unique challenge, I think, with China, and there's definitely similarities with Russia, but it's a little bit different, is that China is challenged on three fronts. It's a bilateral challenge in the relationship between Canada and China. It's absolutely a regional challenge, and we were hearing this from many of our partners in the Indo-Pacific region. I think the Institute has hosted a range of different events and had thought leaders from Japan, South Korea, ASEAN region, India. And I think while there may be different nuances and approaches to the way that they think about China, all countries in the region have different varying concerns about China. Their economic trade practices, some of the security incidents and the security moves that they have, for example, in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the Taiwan Straits, et cetera, et cetera. So China is a bilateral challenge. It's a regional challenge. And then I think the final area is that, of course, it's an international global challenge as well. And we're seeing that the global ambitions that China has and the Chinese Communist Party has is not satiated just in the Indo-Pacific or in East Asia, but is global in nature. And I'm really hoping our podcast sort of gets into this and gets out of this mentality that we often hear, that this is just a great power challenge between the United States and China, and all others are innocent bystanders and should just sort of put their head under the sand. That's really not the case. I think all countries are realizing that China presents unique challenges to them. And I think the last point, which is interesting on the international side, is that Canada is a country that essentially lives on an IV drip of internationalism and multilateral institutions. China has subverted many and most of those as well. The heads of United Nations sub-agencies, the majority of them, sometimes I think it's now over 50%, are headed by Chinese senior officials. We've seen the brokenness of several institutions, including, I would argue, the United Nations Security Council. And this is, I think, a direct interconnection to, maybe for you, Balkan, to talk about Russia, because one analogy that I'll leave off on the international institutions perspective is we've seen it fail from time after time. But for example, in North Korea now, we have both Russia and China actively working to effectively say that the sanctions that they agreed on through the council are no longer valid. And actually, we have one member state, Russia, who maybe you can touch on a bit more, Balkan, is actively actually arming and funding some of the weaponry that Kim Jong-un is now sending into the battlefield in Ukraine. So I think that it's very problematic on a number of levels.
No. I mean, I totally agree, and I think the key point that you highlighted: these are not isolated challenges. This is not about, especially in the case of China, but also very clearly in the case of Russia, these are not defensive policies. This is about changing the rules of the game and reconstructing an international order that is favorable to these authoritarian regimes and their survival. And if we think that this is only a regional challenge, this is only about China trying to protect its interests within its region, we will be sorely mistaken. And I think our European allies and others are now recognizing that this is about who gets to write the rules in the rules-based international order, and China fundamentally wants to alter that order and wants to rewrite the rules that will make China as a preeminent power within this system. So we need to sort of understand that very clearly. I want to jump onto Russia, and then maybe afterwards come back to talk about what really sort of unites, or what really sort of make these countries aligned with each other, and what are the primary drivers of this alignment. I want to come back to that afterwards. When we look at Russia, of course, Russia is an immediate present danger to European and Euro-Atlantic security. The naked territorial aggression, the war crimes, the crime of aggression that Russia opposes and engage in today in Ukraine, killing civilians, targeting civilian infrastructure, kidnappings, rape, torture, all that we see, the damage and massacres that Russia engages in goes against every principle that underlies the post-Second World War international order, from territorial integrity to political independence to sovereignty to human rights. So Russia, in that sense, is a very clear present danger to not only Ukraine, but also to our European allies and to the Euro-Atlantic area, including Canada, very, very clearly. Just a quick reminder for our listeners and viewers that Russia is not far east of us and far away there. Russia is our neighbor up in the north, and we need to keep that in mind. So it's a very present and immediate danger. But it is also important to remember Russia is not only an acute threat, but Russia is a chronic threat that goes beyond the war in Ukraine. So we'll come back to this point again and again throughout this podcast series, that the Russia's war in Ukraine is not only about Ukraine, but it is about defending NATO. It is about defending Euro-Atlantic security, which Canada is a fundamental part, and our prosperity and security have been very tightly interlinked with the security of the Euro-Atlantic area. So it is a chronic threat. It will remain a chronic threat. And we see the Russian meddling across the world. This is not only the frontal assault to sovereignty, democracy, decency, and liberty that we witness in Europe, but through Russian private military companies in Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East, through Wagner and others, through working, as you pointed out, with Iran, with North Korea. Russia is assaulting the very basis of international order, and it sits. Russia, in that sense, sits at the center of this emerging network of authoritarian regimes. Of course, China being the primary partner up there, and the source for technology transfers and resources, etc., to Russia. But at the same time, these other actors, such as Iran and its proxies in the Middle East, Hamas, Hezbollah, so on and so forth, as well as you pointed out, North Korea, a significant challenge that rapidly emerging again as a security concern, and that we are not really talking, I think, enough here in Canada. So we will spend some time talking about North Korea, the nuclear threat that it poses, and the dangers within the Korean Peninsula, and what it poses also to our other allies, such as Japan, in the region. So when I just want to sort of, after sort of looking at these two different challenges specifically, as Russia is a primary threat that would like to destroy the existing security order in Europe and conducting a crime of aggression right now that goes on, to the Chinese attempts to subvert international institutions, weaken them, and rewrite the rules, at the same time intimidating and harassing and increasingly threatening our friends and allies, from Philippines to Taiwan to Japan to South Korea in Indo-Pacific. How do we need to think about the drivers that unites these these two, or aligns these two authoritarian regimes against the existing international order and against Canada and its allies?
Well, I mean, a few things. The complexity of international politics can show that multiple things can be true at the same time. And I think some of the counter arguments, Balkan, that we've heard over the years that, Russia and China, there's a lot of enmity between the two, that they'll never be united, they'll never be allies. I think that there's still a lot of accuracy in the sense that there's resentment, there's competition, there's historical issues between Russia and China. I think that does not preclude some of the real convergence that's going on. And there's a number of reasons on this. I think the principal reason, and I think one good sort of marking point on this, was the collapse of Afghanistan, for example, and the viewpoint of the People's Republic of China and also Russia on this. I mean, neither of them should be natural allies, of course, of the Taliban. But they supported, of course, and were quietly and behind the scenes applauding, of course, at the Americans sort of tucking their tail between their legs and leaving, because that was showing in their minds an erosion of American power. So I think the principal focus, of course, is enemy of my enemy, and that looking at ways to weaken the U.S. and its alliance orbits. NATO, as we note, as much as the Chinese would like to say effectively, American alliances in Asia are the same as NATO, they're not. But this is the narrative that I think both sides want to spin. I think on the danger of the convergences, of course, we have to look at what Russia and China are doing bilaterally themselves. But I think you hit the nail on the head. One of the areas that I love for this podcast, and I'm sure a lot of our guests will dive into, is the vacuum that's number one, created just by itself of their convergence with other authoritarian actors, but also them fueling gas onto the or gas onto the fire of this convergence. So in a couple examples we'll give you, we talked about North Korea. I think Iran is another example. Is number one, and the United Nations Security Council is an example of this. Before, when there was even a remote element of hedging or a remote element that PRC and Russia might want to have somewhat positive relationship with the West, even though they would have alignments to countries like Iran and North Korea, they would at least play by some level of a playbook in the international institutions. That's gone completely. The second thing is the risk tolerance of these other authoritarian actors, realizing that combined with number one, the Russians and the Chinese simply not caring on one side and actually actively abetting them. And then you have the global West, of course, being very distracted on a number of different geopolitical theaters, of course, understandably, with trying to support our Ukrainian friends, worried about the strategic rise of China, tensions in the Middle East. So this has created a vacuum for a lot of these authoritarian actors, and many we're not even mentioning. I mean, we're talking about two of the most well-known ones in Iran and North Korea, but it's provided a vacuum for others to say we can get away with effectively what we want, and the West is not coming in to save the day. The Russians and the Chinese are not going to, number one, they're not going to say anything, and actually they're probably going to help us behind the scenes. So this, I think, has been one of the fault lines for Canada and its allies to look at, is that this is not just a problem of what trouble can the Russians continue to do in the transatlantic sphere, what problems can the Chinese continue to do in the Indo-Pacific sphere. Their sort of convergence together is now becoming a global security problem. We're seeing this firsthand in many different regions.
Exactly. I mean, it's as you pointed out, both of them are increasingly providing institutional, political, and military cover to these other actors to go and challenge and be much more bold in their disruption across the world, and that feeds back into both Russia and China, and make them more confident that they could actually disrupt the system and they could break the existing order and rebuild it to their liking. I wrote about 3 years ago a piece for MLI talking about the Sino-Russian axis, authoritarian axis. And I think sort of the argument I made there in terms of what drives them together is still valid, if not more so. One of the primary, I would say, the drivers of this relationship is that both regimes, both Putin and Xi, despite vast differences that they have in terms of the organizing principles within the country. They are what would I call a neo-authoritarian regime. So it's very much personalized, concentrated power, and they see the world through a very hierarchical lens, what I like to call an animal farm understanding of sovereignty. If you remember George Orwell's famous book, Animal Farm, there's a famous line where the pigs says, well, everyone is equal, but some are more equal than others. So everyone is sovereign, but some are more sovereign than others. And this is the lens in which they interpret the international order. Vladimir Putin is most clear in this. He has said several times, both in words and in deeds, think that most of the countries in the world are not sovereign. They should be under the control of great powers, and Russia have a right to dictate the terms of how others live and what they choose to pursue. And it's what they call the near abroad. But that's increasingly also the story for China under Xi. We see this through the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, attempts to interfere in other countries' internal affairs, suppress speech, affect the laws passed from Australia to Canada to other places, including a bunch of other countries in the region, in the Pacific, especially in ASEAN, etc. So they, in other words, reject the very basis of international order that is based on the sovereign equality of states. They have a very distorted view of what constitutes a sovereign state. The number two, I would say, driver that really brings them together is that they perceive liberal order, Western democracy, as an existential threat to their rule. Right, the regime survival sits at the core for both Vladimir Putin and the Chinese Communist Party. Everything else is filtered through whether it will enhance or erode the regime's security. And for them, the primary and continuing existential threat is the successful existing liberal democratic international order and the existence of the West as the standard bearer for that order. As long as countries like Ukraine or Taiwan exist as free, democratic, successful, prosperous countries, they are a continuous reminder for these regimes that better is always possible, and their people don't need to live under there. So they already believe that we are in a world of us versus them, and the West is an existential threat that needs to be weakened, and that needs to be pushed out, and the order, the international order, should be made safe for authoritarian regimes. And that brings me to the third and last point, that what I believe that really drives them together, in addition to their hostility towards democracy and freedom and the basic understanding of human rights, which they see as a Western imposition. And the third element there is that their belief that the West is weakening, that the West is in decline, and they are in a position right now, particularly China, but also with a different lens, Russia, they are in a position to strike right now, to change and to weaken and destroy the existing order, to modify the existing order to their liking. Right? So their belief that the West is not capable to strike back. The West is not capable to defend its interests and values. And as you pointed out, Afghanistan is one clear example, and attempts to further weaken and paralyze Western and democratic reactions and policies against this geopolitical fires that they keep lighting all around is the third thing. They believe that this is their time to be able to strike back and create a new order that will benefit them and ensure the survival of their regimes. When you take these things, three things together, despite the differences they have, despite the tensions, despite the long-lasting, historical mistrust between these two countries, etc., what unites them in this way is a lot stronger than what really divides them, and that's what we need to really be focusing on.
Yeah, I think I mean, I 100% agree with you. And just sort of one last point, I think, before we end off this, we want to save a little bit of space for all of our great authors who are going to contribute. But I think why this is important, going back to this question about why should Canadians care, why should we be driving this conversation with our allies, is a couple of worrying trends I think we see in a lot of our dialogues with partners, is seeing the challenge that Russia poses, the challenge that China poses as a competitive space. So the idea, number one, that we have a short-term, immediate security challenge with Russia and Russian revisionism, and then on the Chinese side, we have this long-term, complex, complicated challenge that some want to engage on, some others don't. I think we need to think of them both clear-eyed and actually short, medium, and long-term. It's not that one we have to do right now and the others, well, maybe we can have the Japanese and the Americans focused on the Chinese while everyone else is paying attention to Russia. We actually can't look at it as a competitive. We can't look at it as an either or. We have to have the resources and the narrative that this is a shared challenge. Of course, the countries are unique and they have their own unique interests too, and it may articulate itself in different ways. But I think we should resist this temptation to be thinking of these as completely separate, isolated challenges. And that leads me to my last point. And, this is something, of course, we've been pushing in the Canadian context, but we hope many of our allies and partners also take this up, is even when this is seen, whether it's through the national security establishment, whether this is, we just recently have a defense review that came out as well. I think we need to see that integration and resources need to be put forward in that sort of vein as well. Not the idea that, okay, we need to spend really quick, really heavily to help out our Ukrainian friends right now. We do have to do that, but we also need to have the capabilities in place, such as advanced submarines, such as a capable Navy, to ensure that we can be a viable partner in the Indo-Pacific. And of course, in the Arctic, which is an area that we know is going to come up in this podcast series, and it's an area of increasing convergence between Russia and China. So I think we need to, reinforcing that point, that these are not competing spaces. This is not that either, you're focused on Russia or you're focused on China. And I think that's another goal, I think, of this series that we're doing, is that often, even in the analyst and academic community, people are in their silos too. And I think trying to break folks out of their silos and getting some of those who engage on the challenge that China poses in the Indo-Pacific, and those who have focused their careers, of course, on Russia and NATO, and bringing these forces together and having a shared conversation. So I'm really excited for this kickoff and for all the discussions to come forward.
Likewise, I mean, one of the purposes that that there's a reason why we named this as Double Trouble, and it's not because you and I are hosting it together, but the interconnectedness of this, and we need to be thinking about interconnections and how different allies need to coordinate much better, need to pool resources, need to rely on each other's strengths in different regions, different capabilities, different levels. So laying a lattice work of institutions, of policies, of unilaterals, which we will come throughout this series again and again, and develop policies that reinforces each other and talks to each other when we deal with these two interrelated challenges. Because we know that our adversaries are doing that, and we actually need to be pushing back again. This is not about either or, as you pointed out, but we need to be able to chew gum and walk at the same time. We have the resources, and a lot of this podcast will also delve into, and I'm going to end this point. We will also delve into how to do this. Right? We will look at what new institutional forms we need to think about. We will delve into how to increase resilience in our societies in order to push back. How do we talk to our population and make the case for paying the national security premium? How, if we don't want to pay pennies today, we will pay hundreds of dollars in the future, that the intermission from history is over, and that this is a long-term challenge, that if we don't push back today and defend our interests and defend our allies, our prosperity, our security, our values, we will live in a world that neither of us would like to exist, where Russia and China shapes the outcomes and determines our prosperity, our way of life, and poses an imminent threat to our security. So we will get into the very practical policies and how we can work together to ensure our prosperity and security as we go through. So, what we will hope that you will come and join us as we go through. We are hoping to have 2 episodes each month, and we will have guests that will join us to talk about their research, their policies, their books, and how they see Russia and China and the threat and the challenges they pose to Canada, to our friends and allies across the globe. So, very much looking forward to continuing the discussion, Jonathan.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking forward to the discussion, and please stay tuned. We're going to have a lot of great speakers cover even more topics than we've covered in this half an hour. So please stay tuned for the future episodes that we're going to have released.
Exactly. See you next time.